In the autumn of 1889, the mining town of Cedar Hollow, Colorado recorded something that should have been impossible. According to the official territorial census, every child born in the previous 18 months had been delivered in complete silence. No crying. No screaming. Not even the sharp intake of breath that announces new life. The midwives spoke in hushed whispers about babies who emerged with their tiny fists already clenched, their dark eyes open and alert, staring directly at whoever first held them as if they recognized something that adults had long forgotten. What the census didn't record was how these silent children would sit motionless for hours, their heads tilted at identical angles, listening to sounds that no one else could hear. Or how they would suddenly stand in perfect unison during Sunday services, their small faces turned toward the mountains with expressions of knowing that chilled even the hardest miners to the bone. By winter, 14 families had quietly packed their belongings and disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions that the remaining residents were too frightened to ask. Before you hear what happened to those who stayed, remember that places like Cedar Hollow existed all across America during the mining boom. Small communities carved from hostile wilderness, where desperate people brought their hopes and their secrets, never imagining that some secrets have a way of growing in the thin mountain air until they become something far more dangerous than the men who first buried them. The children of Cedar Hollow were trying to warn everyone about what was coming up from the abandoned mine shafts. But by the time the adults understood their silent language, it was already too late to run. Cedar Hollow clung to the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains like a collection of wooden boxes scattered by a careless giant. The town existed for one reason: the silver that ran through the mountain in veins so rich that men would risk everything for a chance to tear it from the earth. In 1887, when the first prospectors arrived, the valley had been empty except for the wind through the pine trees and the occasional elk picking its way down to the stream that would later be dammed to power the stamp mills. Within 2 years, nearly 400 souls had made Cedar Hollow their home. The main street stretched for exactly 6 blocks, lined with the essential businesses of frontier life: Murphy's General Store, the Miners' Rest Saloon, Dr. Elizabeth Crane's medical practice, the Cedar Hollow School, and the First Methodist Church where Reverend Thomas Hayes preached salvation to men who spent their days blasting holes in God's creation. At the end of town, where the road curved toward the mountain, stood the company headquarters of the Silver Crown Mining Corporation, a 2-story building that seemed to watch over the community with windows that reflected the harsh Colorado sun. The houses themselves were simple affairs, most built from the abundant pine that covered the mountainsides. They clustered along 3 parallel streets that ran perpendicular to the main road, each with a small garden plot where wives attempted to coax vegetables from the rocky soil. Behind the houses, laundry lines stretched between poles driven deep into the hard ground, and outhouses stood at respectful distances downwind. It was a town that looked temporary even when it tried to appear permanent, as if everyone understood that Cedar Hollow would last only as long as the silver held out. Life in Cedar Hollow followed the rhythms of the mining operation. The whistle from the Silver Crown headquarters sounded at 5 each morning, calling the men to their shift in the tunnels that honeycombed the mountain. By 6, the stamp mills were thundering, crushing or with a sound that rattled windows and made conversation impossible until sunset. Wives spent their days in relative quiet, tending children and gardens, preparing meals, and trying not to think too hard about the dangers their husbands faced in the darkness beneath their feet. The children of Cedar Hollow had adapted to this harsh environment with the resilience that children always managed to find. They played games among the mine tailings, collected interesting rocks from the waste piles, and learned early to recognize the sound of trouble coming from the mountain. Their playground was a landscape carved by human ambition, where every hill and gully had been shaped by the relentless pursuit of silver. Margaret Whitmore arrived in Cedar Hollow during the summer of 1888, carrying her 11-year-old daughter Sarah and a determination to build a life far from the memories that haunted them in Ohio. Margaret's husband had died in a factory accident in Cincinnati, leaving her with enough money to make a fresh start but not enough to be particular about where that start might take place. Cedar Hollow offered employment for a woman with Margaret's skills in bookkeeping and organization, and the Silver Crown Mining Corporation needed someone to manage their increasingly complex financial records. Sarah Whitmore was a quiet child with pale blonde hair and gray-green eyes that seemed to notice everything while revealing nothing. At 11, she possessed the observational skills of someone much older, a quality that had developed during the difficult months following her father's death when she had learned to read her mother's moods and anticipate her needs without being asked. In Cedar Hollow, these skills would prove to be both a blessing and a curse that would change the course of her young life in ways that no one could have predicted. The Whitmores rented a small house on Pine Street, a two-room structure with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out toward the mountain where the mine entrances gaped like dark mouths against the granite face. Margaret worked in the Silver Crown office during the day while Sarah attended the Cedar Hollow School, a one-room building where Miss Jennifer Chen taught children ranging in age from 6 to 16. Miss Chen, despite her youth and the challenges of frontier education, maintained a classroom where learning flourished even amid the constant noise of the mining operation. During their first months in Cedar Hollow, the Whitmores settled into the community with relative ease. Margaret's efficiency quickly made her invaluable to the mining company, while Sarah's intelligence and quiet demeanor earned her the respect of both Miss Chen and her fellow students. The adjustment to mountain life brought its challenges, but both mother and daughter appreciated the chance to build new lives in a place where their past remained unexamined and their future seemed to depend entirely on their own efforts. It was Sarah who first noticed that something was changing in Cedar Hollow during the early weeks of 1889. Her walk to school took her past several houses where young families lived, and she began to observe patterns that struck her as unusual. Pregnant women who had been active and social throughout their pregnancies suddenly became reclusive as their delivery dates approached. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, who served as the town's only physician and primary midwife, began working longer hours and making house calls at odd times of the day and night. Most striking to Sarah's observant nature was the change in the behavior of families after their babies were born. Parents who had previously been friendly and talkative became quiet and withdrawn. They hurried through their errands in town, avoided lingering conversations, and seemed reluctant to allow visitors into their homes. When Sarah occasionally glimpsed the new babies during chance encounters, she noticed that they were unusually quiet and alert, watching the world around them with an intensity that seemed remarkable for such young children. The first time Sarah witnessed the strange behavior that would eventually terrify the entire community occurred on a crisp February morning as she walked to school. She was passing the Henderson house when she noticed movement in the front yard that made her stop and stare. Little James Henderson, who was barely 8 months old, was sitting unsupported in the snow, wearing only a thin cotton dress despite the freezing temperature. The baby showed no signs of discomfort from the cold, instead sitting perfectly still with his dark eyes fixed on something in the distance that Sarah could not see. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the house moments later, her face pale with an expression that mixed relief and fear in equal measure. She scooped up the baby without speaking and hurried back inside, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of the child's face. James Henderson's expression was not that of a normal 8-month-old infant. His eyes held a focus and awareness that seemed far beyond his age, and his small features were set in lines of concentration that belonged on an adult face. Sarah continued to school that morning with a growing sense that something fundamental had changed in Cedar Hollow, though she could not yet articulate what that change might mean. Throughout the day, she found herself thinking about the Henderson baby and the other infants she had observed around town. Their unusual behavior seemed to follow patterns that her analytical mind struggled to understand, but which felt increasingly important as the days passed. The pattern became clearer during the following weeks as Sarah paid closer attention to the families with young children. She noticed that the babies born during the previous year shared several characteristics that distinguished them from older children in the community. They rarely cried, even when hungry or uncomfortable. They displayed an unusual alertness to sounds and movements that other people seemed unable to detect. Most unsettling, they often moved or reacted in ways that seemed coordinated, as if they were responding to signals that only they could perceive. Dr. Elizabeth Crane had been practicing medicine in frontier communities for nearly a decade before arriving in Cedar Hollow, and she prided herself on maintaining professional composure in even the most challenging circumstances. But the deliveries she had attended during the past 18 months had tested her medical knowledge and her understanding of normal human development in ways that left her questioning everything she thought she knew about childbirth and infant behavior. The first unusual delivery had occurred in March of 1888, when she attended the birth of the Morrison family's third child. The labor progressed normally, and baby Ruth Morrison emerged after a delivery that was unremarkable in every medical sense. But instead of the crying that typically announces a successful birth, Ruth Morrison had entered the world in complete silence. Her breathing was strong and regular, her color was healthy, and all her reflexes appeared normal, but she made no sound whatsoever. Dr. Crane had initially attributed this silence to individual variation in infant behavior, though she made careful notes in her medical journal about the unusual presentation. However, as similar births occurred throughout the following months, she began to recognize a pattern that defied medical explanation. By the end of 1888, every baby born in Cedar Hollow had been delivered in complete silence, and all of them displayed the same unusual alertness and coordinated behavior that Sarah Whitmore had begun to observe. The medical implications troubled Dr. Crane deeply. In her experience, the crying of newborn infants served crucial physiological functions, helping to clear fluid from the lungs and establish strong breathing patterns. The silence of these babies suggested either a developmental abnormality that affected their vocal abilities, or something even more unusual that fell outside her medical training. She had written letters to colleagues in Denver and San Francisco, describing the phenomenon and requesting advice, but the responses she received offered no explanations for what she was observing. More disturbing than the silence was the behavior of these children as they grew. They reached developmental milestones at normal or accelerated rates, but their interactions with the world around them seemed qualitatively different from those of typical children. They showed little interest in toys or games that delighted other children their age, instead focusing their attention on activities that seemed to serve purposes that adults could not understand. The children would sit for hours in specific locations around their homes, always facing the same direction, their heads tilted at identical angles as if listening to something that only they could hear. They showed no distress during these episodes, instead displaying expressions of intense concentration that suggested they were receiving information of great importance. When interrupted during these sessions, they would turn toward the interrupting adult with expressions of patience rather than annoyance, as if they understood that adults simply could not comprehend what they were experiencing. During the winter months of 1889, Dr. Crane began to document more unusual behaviors among the silent children. They seemed to possess an unusual sensitivity to vibrations and sounds that were barely perceptible to adults. They would react to events several minutes before those events became apparent to others, turning toward doors before visitors arrived, becoming agitated before storms struck, and displaying signs of distress before mining accidents occurred at the Silver Crown operation. The mining accident that occurred on February 15, 1889, marked the beginning of the community's growing awareness that something was seriously wrong in Cedar Hollow. The collapse in Tunnel 7 trapped 6 miners for nearly 12 hours before rescue crews could reach them. 3 men died in the collapse, while the survivors suffered injuries that would prevent them from ever working underground again. The accident itself was not unusual for mining operations of the period, but the behavior of the silent children during the crisis revealed capabilities that went far beyond normal human perception. According to multiple witnesses, every child born during the previous 18 months had begun showing signs of extreme agitation approximately 30 minutes before the tunnel collapse occurred. They had abandoned their normal activities and gathered near windows and doors facing the mountain, their small faces turned toward the mine with expressions of distress that their parents had never seen before. Several of the children had begun making gestures that seemed designed to communicate urgent information, pointing toward the mountain and tugging at their parents' clothing with unusual persistence. Mrs. Elena Morrison later told Dr. Crane that her daughter Ruth had grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the front door with surprising strength, all while making soft humming sounds that seemed intended to convey urgency. When Mrs. Morrison had not responded to these signals, Ruth had begun crying for the first time since her birth, producing sounds that were so heart-wrenching that her mother had finally followed her outside. From their front porch, they had watched the dust cloud rise from the mountain as Tunnel 7 collapsed, exactly 30 minutes after Ruth had first tried to warn her mother about the impending disaster. Similar stories emerged from other families throughout Cedar Hollow. The silent children had attempted to communicate the danger to their parents using gestures, sounds, and behaviors that adults had not understood until it was too late to prevent the tragedy. The implications of this coordinated response to an event that had not yet occurred forced the community to confront the possibility that these children possessed abilities that challenged everything they thought they understood about human nature. Sarah Whitmore had been in school when the mining accident occurred, but she had observed the behavior of the younger children in Miss Chen's classroom during the minutes leading up to the collapse. The 3 students who fell into the group of silent children had suddenly become restless and agitated, abandoning their lessons to stand near the windows facing the mountain. Their distress had been so apparent that Miss Chen had begun moving toward them when the sound of the collapse reached the schoolhouse. The coordination of their response and the timing of their distress in relation to the actual accident convinced Sarah that these children were somehow aware of events before they occurred. Her analytical mind began working on the problem with the same systematic approach she had learned to apply to mathematics and science. If the silent children could sense impending disasters, what other information might they be receiving? And why were they the only ones who seemed capable of accessing this information? That evening, Sarah shared her observations with her mother, describing the unusual behavior she had witnessed and her growing conviction that the silent children possessed some form of extraordinary perception. Margaret Whitmore listened to her daughter's theories with a mixture of concern and skepticism that characterized her approach to most of Sarah's more imaginative ideas. But the precision of Sarah's observations and the documented timing of the children's distress in relation to the mining accident made it difficult to dismiss her conclusions entirely. As March arrived in Cedar Hollow, bringing with it the first hints of spring warmth and the promise of another mining season, the community found itself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. The silent children continued to display behaviors that suggested they were receiving information through channels that adults could neither access nor understand. Their parents struggled with the growing realization that their children might be experiencing reality in ways that fell far outside normal human experience. The atmosphere in Cedar Hollow began to change as word of the children's unusual abilities spread through the community. Some residents viewed the children's apparent prescience as a gift that might help protect the town from future disasters. Others worried that such abilities might indicate something unnatural or dangerous about the children themselves. The division between these perspectives would soon split the community and lead to decisions that would determine the fate of everyone who called Cedar Hollow home. Dr. Crane increased her efforts to understand the medical aspects of the children's condition, while Sarah Whitmore continued her careful observations of their behavior patterns. Neither of them could have predicted that their investigations would soon uncover evidence of something far more disturbing than unusual sensory abilities. The silent children were not just perceiving threats that had not yet materialized. They were responding to communications from sources that the adults of Cedar Hollow had long forgotten existed, buried deep in the mountain along with silver and secrets that should have remained undisturbed. The truth about what was happening in Cedar Hollow lay in the abandoned sections of the Silver Crown mine, where earlier excavations had broken through into chambers that had been sealed for reasons that were never recorded in any official documents. The children's silence was not a medical condition or a supernatural gift. It was their response to voices that called to them from the darkness beneath the mountain, voices that belonged to something that had been waiting patiently for new generations to arrive who might be young enough and innocent enough to hear what it had been trying to say. As spring progressed and the mining operations expanded deeper into the mountain, the children's behavior would become increasingly urgent and coordinated. Their attempts to communicate with the adults would grow more desperate as the thing in the abandoned tunnels grew stronger and more insistent in its demands. By summer, the residents of Cedar Hollow would understand that their children's silence had been their final warning about what was coming up from the depths, and that the time for escape had already passed. The revelation that would change everything came on a warm April morning when Sarah Whitmore made a discovery that connected the silent children's behavior to the forgotten history of Cedar Hollow itself. While exploring the area around the old mine tailings during a school recess, she found something that previous residents had tried to hide but which time and mountain weather had gradually exposed. What she discovered would explain not only why the children had been born in silence, but why something deep in the mountain had been waiting for them to arrive. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris and deliberately concealed by carefully placed rocks, Sarah found the remains of structures that predated the Silver Crown mining operation by several years. The foundations were constructed of carefully fitted stone, built with a precision that spoke of permanent rather than temporary occupation. More significant were the symbols carved into the foundation stones, symbols that depicted figures descending into the earth and emerging changed in ways that the crude carvings could only suggest. Among the ruins, Sarah discovered fragments of metal that had been worked into shapes she could not identify, along with tools that seemed designed for purposes beyond simple mining. Most disturbing were the remnants of what appeared to be deliberate excavations that had been backfilled and concealed, leaving only subtle depressions in the earth to mark where earlier inhabitants had been digging into the mountain for reasons that had nothing to do with silver extraction. As Sarah examined these artifacts, she began to understand that Cedar Hollow had been inhabited before the mining boom, by people who had been drawn to the mountain for reasons that remained hidden in the symbols and structures they had left behind. Their excavations had apparently discovered something in the depths that had either driven them away or changed them in ways that made their departure necessary. The timing of their abandonment and the careful concealment of their activities suggested that they had encountered something that they believed needed to remain buried. That evening, Sarah brought several of the smaller artifacts home to show her mother, along with her theories about what they might represent. Margaret Whitmore examined the carved symbols and worked metal pieces with growing unease, recognizing in their deliberate concealment evidence of secrets that previous residents had died to protect. The precision of the stonework and the sophistication of the metal artifacts suggested a level of organization and purpose that went far beyond simple prospecting. Mother and daughter spent hours that night discussing the implications of Sarah's discovery, trying to connect the abandoned settlement to the unusual behavior of the silent children. Margaret's experience with financial records and organizational systems helped her recognize patterns in the artifacts that suggested systematic rather than random activity. The previous inhabitants had been working toward specific goals, goals that had required years of careful preparation and significant resources. The connection between the abandoned settlement and the children's abilities became clear when Sarah realized that the locations where she had found the most significant artifacts corresponded exactly to the directions that the silent children faced during their periods of intense listening. The children were not randomly oriented during these episodes. They were focusing their attention on specific points around the mountain where the previous inhabitants had conducted their deepest excavations. This realization led Sarah to a theory that frightened her even as it explained everything she had observed. The silent children were not developing unusual abilities spontaneously. They were responding to something that had been awakened or released by the earlier inhabitants, something that had remained dormant until new generations arrived who might be receptive to its influence. Their silence was not a medical condition but a form of communication, a way of receiving and processing information from sources that adults could no longer access. The implications of this theory forced Sarah and her mother to confront questions that challenged their understanding of reality itself. If the children were in communication with something from the abandoned excavations, what was the nature of that something? What did it want from the children? And what would happen as the children grew older and more responsive to its influence? Margaret Whitmore's practical nature rebelled against supernatural explanations, but the evidence was becoming too consistent to ignore. The timing of the children's birth, their unusual behavior, and the discovery of the abandoned settlement all pointed toward some form of connection between past and present that transcended normal causation. As a woman who had rebuilt her life through careful planning and rational decision-making, she struggled to accept that forces beyond human understanding might be affecting her daughter and the other children of Cedar Hollow. The decision to investigate further led Sarah and Margaret to approach Dr. Crane with their discoveries and theories. Dr. Crane examined the artifacts with the same systematic attention she applied to medical problems, looking for evidence that might support or contradict their conclusions. Her scientific training made her skeptical of supernatural explanations, but her experience with the silent children had already forced her to question the boundaries of normal human development. Together, the three women began to compile a comprehensive record of everything they had observed about the children's behavior, correlating it with Sarah's archaeological discoveries and Dr. Crane's medical observations. The pattern that emerged suggested that the silent children were part of a process that had begun years before any of them were born, a process that connected the current residents of Cedar Hollow to whatever the previous inhabitants had discovered in the depths of the mountain. As their investigation deepened, they realized that the children's unusual abilities were intensifying as the Silver Crown mining operation expanded its excavations. The correlation between the depth of current mining activities and the children's behavioral changes suggested that the modern mining was approaching areas that the previous inhabitants had deliberately sealed. If their theory was correct, the current residents of Cedar Hollow were unknowingly releasing something that earlier generations had died trying to contain. The urgency of this realization led them to examine the Silver Crown mining records, looking for evidence of unusual discoveries or encounters during their excavation activities. What they found in the company files would confirm their worst fears and reveal that the mining corporation had been aware of the previous settlement and its activities from the beginning. The Silver Crown operation had not accidentally chosen Cedar Hollow as their location. They had come specifically because of what the earlier inhabitants had discovered, and they had been working systematically to uncover what those earlier residents had tried to hide. The truth about the Silver Crown Mining Corporation's real purpose in Cedar Hollow emerged from company documents that Margaret Whitmore discovered during her regular bookkeeping duties. Hidden among routine correspondence and financial records were references to archaeological surveys, geological assessments, and consultation fees paid to experts in fields that had nothing to do with silver mining. The corporation had been conducting two parallel operations: the public mining of silver ore and a secret excavation project that targeted the areas where the previous inhabitants had conducted their mysterious work. Internal memoranda revealed that the Silver Crown executives had been aware of the abandoned settlement before they began operations in Cedar Hollow. They had commissioned surveys of the earlier excavations and had deliberately planned their mining tunnels to intersect with the areas that previous inhabitants had marked as significant. The timing of their arrival and the specific locations they had chosen for their primary shafts were not coincidental. They had come to Cedar Hollow to finish what the earlier inhabitants had started. More disturbing were references to consultations with academic experts in fields that seemed unrelated to mining operations. The company had employed archaeologists, anthropologists, and specialists in what the documents euphemistically described as cultural research. These consultants had provided advice on excavation techniques, artifact preservation, and what appeared to be protocols for handling discoveries that fell outside normal archaeological experience. The birth of the Silent Children had not been an unexpected development. Company documents included correspondence with medical specialists who had provided guidance on monitoring and documenting unusual developments in the local population. Dr. Crane's reports on the children's deliveries and subsequent behavior had been systematically copied to corporate headquarters, where they were being analyzed by consultants whose expertise lay in areas that the company files did not specify. Margaret's discovery of these documents forced her to realize that her employment with the Silver Crown Corporation had made her an unwitting participant in whatever they were attempting to accomplish. Her financial records and organizational skills had been helping to coordinate an operation that went far beyond silver mining, an operation that treated the residents of Cedar Hollow as experimental subjects rather than employees and neighbors. The weight of this knowledge led Margaret to make copies of the most significant documents before approaching Sarah and Dr. Crane with what she had discovered. Together, they began to understand that the Silent Children were not random victims of some supernatural phenomenon. They were the intended result of the Silver Crown Corporation's activities, products of a deliberate process that combined modern mining techniques with knowledge derived from the earlier inhabitants' work. The corporation's ultimate goals remained unclear from the documents Margaret had accessed, but the systematic nature of their approach suggested planning that extended far beyond simple profit from silver extraction. They were working toward specific objectives that required both the awakening of whatever lay in the depths of the mountain and the presence of children who could serve as intermediaries in communications with that entity. This realization transformed their understanding of the danger facing Cedar Hollow. The Silent Children were not developing unusual abilities that might someday become problematic. They were already serving purposes that the Silver Crown Corporation had planned from the beginning. Their unusual behavior and apparent prescience were not gifts or curses, but evidence that they were being actively influenced by forces that the corporation had deliberately awakened. As spring advanced toward summer, the children's behavior became increasingly coordinated and purposeful. They began gathering at specific locations around the town at predetermined times, their movements suggesting that they were responding to instructions or guidance that adults could not perceive. Their periods of intense listening became longer and more frequent, and their expressions during these episodes showed levels of concentration and understanding that seemed far beyond their ages. Dr. Crane documented changes in the children's physical development that corresponded to their behavioral evolution. They were growing faster than normal children their age, but their growth seemed focused on specific areas of brain and nervous system development. Medical examinations revealed unusual neural activity that suggested their brains were processing information in ways that differed significantly from typical human patterns. The correlation between the children's development and the progress of the Silver Crown mining operation became impossible to ignore. As the mining crews penetrated deeper into areas that the earlier inhabitants had marked as significant, the children's responses became more intense and coordinated. They were clearly receiving stronger and more specific communications from whatever the mining operation was approaching. Sarah's continued exploration of the abandoned settlement sites revealed additional artifacts and structures that confirmed the sophisticated nature of the earlier inhabitants' activities. They had not been simple prospectors or settlers, but organized researchers working with knowledge and techniques that seemed far advanced for their historical period. Their excavations had been conducted with scientific precision, and their artifacts suggested technologies and purposes that challenged conventional understanding of 19th-century capabilities. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when Sarah discovered a cache of documents that the earlier inhabitants had sealed in a metal container buried near their main excavation site. The papers, written in multiple languages and protected by careful waterproofing, contained detailed records of their discoveries and warnings about the consequences of their work. What they had found in the depths of the mountain was not a mineral deposit or geological formation, but something that had been deliberately placed there by influences that predated human civilization in North America. The earlier inhabitants had discovered that they were not the first to find what lay beneath the mountain. Evidence pointed to a succession of previous excavators spanning centuries, each group drawn by the same influences that had brought them to Cedar Hollow. Each group had apparently succeeded in awakening whatever slept in the depths, only to discover that they lacked the ability to control what they had released. The abandoned settlements around the mountain represented the remains of groups who had either fled or been transformed by their encounters with the entity they had sought to contact. The Silent Children of Cedar Hollow were the latest generation in this long sequence of contacts, bred and prepared specifically for their role as intermediaries. The Silver Crown Corporation represented the most sophisticated attempt yet to establish controlled communication with the entity, using modern mining techniques and scientific methods to achieve what previous groups had attempted through cruder means. But the documents left by the earlier inhabitants contained warnings that the corporation had either ignored or dismissed. The entity in the depths was not simply waiting to be contacted. It was actively working to expand its influence, using each group of intermediaries to prepare for the next phase of its emergence. The silent children were not just communicating with something beneath the mountain. They were being prepared to serve as vessels for its manifestation in the human world. As summer approached and the children's transformation accelerated, the residents of Cedar Hollow began to understand that they were not simply witnessing unusual developments in their community. They were participating in the final stages of a process that had been building for generations, a process that would soon transform not only their children but the very nature of human existence in the Colorado mountains. The entity beneath the mountain had been patient, but its patience was nearing an end. The silent children were almost ready to fulfill their intended purpose, and the mining operation was approaching the chambers where it had waited for centuries to reclaim the world it had once dominated. The only question that remained was whether the adults of Cedar Hollow would be able to stop what was coming, or whether they too would join the long line of human servants who had helped to prepare for its return. The confrontation that would determine the fate of Cedar Hollow began on the longest day of summer, when the silent children finally broke their silence to deliver a message that froze the blood of everyone who heard it. Speaking in perfect unison with voices that carried harmonics no human throat could produce, they announced that the time of waiting was over, and that those who had called them into existence could now witness the completion of the work that had begun before recorded history. The mountain was ready to give up its secret, and the world above would never be the same again.